So hello, everyone. Welcome to the session today on trauma-informed teaching. My name is Stephanie Richter. I'm the Director of Teaching Excellence and Support in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning here at Northern Illinois University. I am not facilitating today, but I am more than happy to welcome all of you. Trauma-informed support and practice has really become, I think, front and center for us at NIU. But I do want to frame today's discussion that this is not a new need, it's not a new issue, but it is one perhaps that's been exacerbated or that we've become more aware of. It's become more visible to us as a result of the panic, of the racial unrest, and just in general, I think the competing stresses and increasing pressure on all of us, but particularly on our students. Today, I do want to point out we have automatic transcription enabled. You'll be able to access that if it's not already on from the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Just click live transcript to be able to view those throughout the session today. If you'd like to ask a question at any time, please feel free to put that into the text chat, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the session as well. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. We are joined by Giselle Navarro, who is actually a very experienced professional and student at NIU. So she's currently a PhD student in the Counselor Education and Supervision program here. She graduated from the University of Chicago with a Master of Arts degree in Clinical Social Service Administration. Her professional background includes clinical work in elementary schools, high schools, inpatient facilities, foster care services, autism home support services, and substance use intensive outpatient programs. She has worked as a counselor specialist at NIU's Counseling and Consultation Services, leading the Substance Use Assessment Prevention and Education Program. My apologies there. She also teaches undergraduate and graduate students within NIU's Department of Counseling and Higher Education. With that, Giselle, I'd like to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm happy to be with you all here. You gave such a good, thorough description of my background. I just want to say I'm happy to be here. My name's Giselle. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I want to acknowledge that this topic, like Stephanie was saying, is not new, but it is quite challenging. Please do whatever it is you need to do during this presentation, after this presentation, to take care of you in any way that would benefit you. And I want to start off with a quote from Audre Lorde. She says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation." So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself today and always, of course. So let's jump into our learning objectives. We're going to have about 30 minutes of content. I'm going to be asking you questions along the way. Please feel free to use the chat function, which Stephanie will be taking a look at and monitoring to answer questions, or you can also just unmute and jump in. So our learning objectives for today is that you'll be able to define trauma and recognize its prevalence, especially in college students. I also hope that you'll be able to identify ways that trauma impacts teaching and learning. We're also going to be looking at how to apply SAMHSA's 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed teaching. And we will identify teaching strategies to apply some of this trauma-informed teaching principles. So I want to introduce first the concept of your North Star. Following your North Star. And your North Star can be compared to what's deeply important to you as a person and as an educator. What grounds your journey as an educator here at NIU? And so here are some different values that might come up that really maybe encompass your North Star as an educator. So what I want you to do is take some time to reflect here. What kind of educator do you want to be? Why are you in this workshop today? What's important to you? And share it in the chat. Okay, so we have social justice, understanding, creativity, inclusivity, thank you, caring, safety, trust, acceptance, all of the above, inclusion, humility, creativity, honesty, being empowering and transformational, authentic, ooh, so many, humility, creativity, service, safety and acceptance, compassion, inclusion and trust, kindness, inspiration, being understanding. Great, perfect, thank you. Peace, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So taking a moment just to reflect and ground into the kind of educator you want to be and how that might overlap with trauma-informed principles. Let's jump in and talk about what is trauma. So here you're going to see that trauma are events or experiences that are unbearable and intolerable. And I want to start with a framework for this workshop, which I'm going to use Harry Potter. Why Harry Potter? Because Harry Potter experienced so many different traumatic events from the time he was a baby up until he graduated from his institution as a student, Hogwarts. And the way I like to think about trauma is that it's something that can be compared to, this darkness that can hit us, and it's very common. So part of some of the statistics that I found were about 1 in 5 people are sexually abused as children. About 1 in 4 children were beaten by parents. About 1 in 3 couples engage in violence, and about 1 in 8 have witnessed their mother being hit. This comes from the CDC. So trauma is common. It impacts a lot of people. It impacts our students, and it impacts us as teachers. So trauma is an event or series of events, and this comes directly from the American Psychiatric Association in what's known as the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. So according to the DSM-5, it is actual or threatened death, violent or accidental, serious injury or sexual violence. This can be either directly experienced, witnessed, learned about by happening to a loved one, or it can be experienced, repeated extreme exposure to details of events. This can be, for example, happening to first respondents, people that are on the scenes, and also counselors, social workers, psychologists, and people that hear people's traumatic stories day in and day out. And you'll see Harry Potter, some images here, some of the different traumatic events he went through all along the way, right? His struggle with Lord Voldemort, witnessing his mother die in front of him as a child, many different professors and different adults that he cared for and trusted turning against him, not knowing who to trust, witnessing his friends die. So there's a lot of different things he went through here that overlap. So let's take a look at some of the symptoms from the DSM-5 that post-traumatic stress disorder encompasses. So the first domain would be re-experiencing of the traumatic event. So this can be in terms of flashbacks, feeling like you're re-experiencing what happened in the now, intrusive or distressing memories. It can be very painful nightmares of what happened over and over again. It can also be physiological and psychological distress when you're reminded or exposed to reminders of what happened. The next domain is in terms of avoidance, and it is a cluster or symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's part of what can feed the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this would be very active avoidance of not wanting to experience internal reminders of what happened, and also wanting to avoid external reminders of what happened. So people, places, and things, memories, thoughts, sensations. We can be an active avoidance of those different reminders. The third cluster of symptoms that can happen is feeling very reactive. So easily startled, feeling very tense or on edge. There can be a disturbance to sleep. So not getting, the recommended hours of sleep or having really restless sleep, difficulty with nightmares, which can then affect sleep quality. This can then lead into difficulty concentrating when awake. This can also be seen as self-destructive behavior or getting in really high-risk situations, and irritability and anger outbursts that can happen in lashing out or screaming or hitting things or getting into fights. So that would be more around the reactivity. There's also changes that happen to people's thoughts and mood, right? So a lot of times survivors of trauma can, after experiencing these events, really adopt negative self-critical thoughts and very painful feelings about themselves, other people, and the world. They can struggle with a sense of connection, so they can feel oftentimes disconnected from other people, like they cannot trust others, or even disconnected from themselves. They can lose interest in the things they used to love, the things they used to enjoy. They can have very intense, distorted feelings of guilt, shame, of self-blame, of fear, of terror. So in touching on what traumatic events can look like, according to the DSM-5, right, we're going to expand this definition and how it can impact people just physiologically, also related to their mood, related to how they show up. How would you think that these experiences might influence teaching and learning for students? What are your thoughts about that? Feel free to share in the chat. Difficulty to focus, absolutely. Reactivity to certain topics, yes. They might be afraid to speak up, yes. Lots of shame, absolutely. It can impact their effective domain of learning. Yeah, it can be really difficult to learn. Difficulty motivating themselves to get work done, absolutely, yes. So that goal-oriented, being able to get the things done can be impacted. Inability to connect to information. Yep. It can also make topics more challenging to engage with if it reminds them of trauma. Absolutely. Yes. So like we said, those reminders can be really triggering physiologically and psychologically for survivors of trauma. Absences can be a red flag. Absolutely. Missing classes. Avoidance may manifest as not coming to class. Disconnection from others, disconnection from class. They can be triggered by something an instructor might say, absolutely, microaggressions, difficulty with memory. It can look like avoidance of a task, yeah, fatigue, yes, so many things. Sleeping in class, like you said, decreased motivation, awesome. So you all have a pretty good understanding of how survivors of trauma can have a very difficult time learning and teaching. This can really manifest for people and for us, right? This is something that impacts everyone, can impact everyone. So let's talk a little bit about what the research says. So in a study by Felitti and colleagues in 1998, it was a very famous study, and part of what he and his colleagues did is he created a survey called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, and they surveyed over 17,000 participants. And what they did was they separated out different events that could be perceived as traumatic or experienced as traumatic in these different domains. So different types of abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction here. And what they did was they used a tally score. So if you identified with experiencing this before the age of 18, you would get a score of 1 for each of the ones you endorsed. And again, what they found and what's being, replicated in research is that the adverse childhood experiences study is that trauma is common, right? Trauma is common. So at least 61% of participants in the study had one ACE, right? One adverse childhood experience. And what they did find is as ACE scores increased, so did the risk for adult chronic illnesses, depression, substance use, shortened life expectancy, and suicide attempts. So as we're thinking about trauma, I want to introduce the image of glass, right? So imagine we have this perfect glass in front of us, and the glass falls to the floor and shatters. This can be what it's like for people in terms of their worldview and their beliefs about themselves, others, right? So here, Mark Goldstein states, unlike simple stress, trauma changes your view of your life and yourself. It can shatter your most basic assumptions about yourself and the world. For example, life is good, I'm safe, people are kind, I can trust others, and the future will likely be good. This can be replaced with feelings and thoughts like the world is dangerous. I can't win, I'll never win. I can't trust other people. There is no hope. So we went through some of the different symptoms based on the DSM-5, but let's look at the experience of people, right? So re-experiencing with trauma, this is a quote from an Oklahoma City bombing survivor, Paul Heath. And what he says is, starting at the moment that the bomb went off, I had a mental video and audio of that day's experiences that played 24 hours a day, along with everything else I was doing. And connect to what that might be like. People are having this re-experiencing day in and day out, how that impacts learning and teaching. Let's look at avoidance. Oftentimes, trauma and addiction can go together, trauma and substance use in general. So from here, another person, trauma survivor, the more I use, the more I won't feel anything. Sometimes the pain is so bad, you just want to die, and there's no other way out. If you talk about it, it will hurt too much. So instead, keep it a secret and no one will know. Reactivity from another trauma survivor. I didn't protect myself. The gut instinct that flashes danger was switched off for me. I walked into harm's way, bad situations and relationships all the time. I was just used to life being hard. Okay, so let's switch gears into looking at prevalence. So we talked about trauma being really common, and we know that from the research. We just cited some brief research on that. But how prevalent do you think trauma is in college students? If you were to guess a percentage from 0 to 100% of college students have experienced trauma, where do you think that would be? And feel free to share your guess in the chat. And I'll read out a couple. I won't read all of them, but I'll read out a couple. How common? 75, 65, 70, 80, 100%, yeah. Okay, yes, good guesses. So from this study, Carl and Butler, and they found in 2015 that about 66% to 94% of college students reported exposure to at least one or more traumatic events. So our college students are survivors of trauma. It's very highly prevalent. So in connecting to what trauma is, the impact of trauma, how common it is, how prevalent it is for students and teachers, for people, right? What does it mean, again, to be a trauma-informed educator? how can we start adopting principles of being trauma-informed? What are your ideas here? Feel free to share in the chat. Any ideas? How would you accommodate for how common trauma is as an educator? What would you do? Flexibility, yes. Listening, leading with empathy and options, absolutely. Mindfulness, being observant, providing opportunities to share, being kind, being understanding. Yeah, those are great ideas. Absolutely. So we're going to talk about all those different things, and y'all are hitting it already on the head here. So here are some of the principles that are recommended by SAMHSA. The first principle that they recommend enhancing in the classroom is safety. And so going back to the Harry Potter metaphor, Harry Potter is the student and he's working with these professors that are trying to mentor him. Some professors he doesn't know if he can trust or not, right? And so in the words of Dumbledore, one of the image of what I would say of that more trauma-informed professor, he says, words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it. So let's look at safety. On one end, we have Professor Dumbledore, who can invoke some of those more trauma-informed principles and spirit. And on the other hand, we have Professor Umbridge, who, if anyone knows Harry Potter, tended to, the things that she would do in the classroom would be re-traumatizing. There was that potential for re-traumatization, and I think even she acted pretty abusive in some ways. And so how can we invoke some of more of this Dumbledore trauma-informed principles? Well, we can include low-stake items, low-stake assignments in our syllabus and designing our course with those things so that students can get feedback all along the way and not feeling like they have, on the other hand, all of these high-stake assignments worth all the points and not a lot of room for feedback or for making mistakes. Further, how we can enhance safety would be meaningful feedback on assignments and opportunities to learn from mistakes, modeling appropriate boundaries so that clarity in your syllabus and verbally, times that you will contact and respond to them, and then following through on that, right? So if you say you're going to respond within 24 hours to an email, making sure you're doing those things. And then providing some of those important content warnings if you are knowing that you're going to be diving into some challenging material. So also another thing to be aware of is your learning environment and the kind of environment you're structuring as a professor. Having some guidelines, especially in the first couple classes, on what helps students to feel safe enough in your classroom. Maybe highlighting that, writing that out, and holding people accountable to those guidelines and honoring people's needs in that space. On the other hand, things that could cause re-traumatization, and this is kind of a spectrum, right? This is not all or nothing, but on the other hand, on the opposite side, no room for error, being really punitive, having inappropriate or unclear, ambiguous boundaries, and not having or providing those content warnings. Okay. One of the other principles that's recommended with trauma-informed teaching is enhancing trust. So J.K. Rowling says, from Dumbledore, he says, dark times lie ahead of us, and there will be a time when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. So standing in those values, standing in moving toward that North Star, and standing in your integrity as an educator, coming from a place of what's truly important to you to support students, enhancing trust. So let's look at some of the things that were recommended in the literature as trauma-informed educators. So on the Dumbledore side, trauma-informed, being clear. So clear is kind, right? Have clear, specific policies outlined in your syllabus, being consistent in the implementation of those policies so that students can trust that you have their best interests at heart, being responsive to emails and having clear routines and clear class agendas so they know what to expect. Also, again, like I said, holding those policies, but also having that flexibility, there's space to make mistakes, right? And trust that so the students can find that the trust that you inspire is well earned and that you want them to grow and you work towards building out that teacher alliance. On the opposite end, some things that are really going to harm trust and also can have a potential for re-traumatization on the umbrage side. Being unclear, having ambiguous policies, not having a consistent implementation of policies, so students don't know exactly what to expect. Students reach out for support, you don't respond to emails like you said you would, or coming into class without structure, without routines, no communicated class agenda. Sometimes knowing what to expect is the piece that students need to come to that space ready to learn. And so any way that you can enhance that for students can be helpful. That consistent structure can really build and enhance trust. Okay. The next principle that you'll want to be thinking about is support. So Dumbledore again will invoke his trauma-informed spirit. And he says, of course it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real? Right, so a lot of things were happening to Harry, inside Harry, his memories, the things he was experiencing. And Dumbledore consistently validated that and was a space for Harry to talk through some of those things. So how can we be supportive in a Dumbledore style trauma-informed fashion? We can provide resources, right? And a lot of professors already do this. We provide resources inside the syllabus. We provide those different access to tutoring. We can also incorporate guest speakers, people who have different identities and representative of different marginalized identities as well. Speakers that can really enhance students' perception of the strengths base and resiliency. Also finding ways to hook peers up so that they can support each other, that peer mentorship piece. So, that can be helpful in building relationships, building support, announcing community events. Sometimes a relationship touch is needed. So just having it in the syllabus is a really great start. But sometimes, as you're having a conversation with the student or you're noticing a need, saying, oh, there's this really helpful resource on the syllabus here. Would you like me to send it to you? Right. So kind of making that connection and using the relationship to help connect students to what the resources they need at school. On the opposite side, potential for re-traumatization could be, not providing different resources, not scaffolding, not conveying an understanding that it's hard being a student, that it's okay to make mistakes, that we make mistakes too, we're people, and not connecting to that place and that value of compassion and support, right? So those are things that could be potentially re-traumatizing. Okay. The next principle in trauma-informed teaching is going to invoke collaboration. You all hit on a lot of these different things. You all, sounds like we have some already trauma-informed educators here. And so part of what Dumbledore says is a child's voice, however honest and true, is meaningless to those who have forgotten how to listen. How are we listening to our students? How are we working from a spirit of collaboration, honoring their voices, honoring the expertise that they also bring into the room? Let's look at some ways that are recommended in the literature. So on the Dumbledore trauma-informed side, being able to open up spaces, for students to share their voice. doing with students. So that collaborative feedback on assignments, maybe having the students come alongside you as you're working on something so that you can model with them. Involving students in evaluation. How do you think you did on this assignment? Maybe opportunities built into the syllabus to have them reflect on their progress and then coming to the table alongside them in that evaluation process. Also, feedback on assignments. So assignment options to meet learning objectives and being clear around that, how you're collaborating with them to help with their learning, help with their growth, and that's your intention. On the flip side, on the Umbridge side, these things could potentially re-traumatize people, especially survivors. So shutting down student voice, we're not going to talk about that. So when students feel like they are silenced, they don't have a voice, they're not able to collaborate on what it is they need to learn in that classroom, that could be really detrimental to students, especially survivors of trauma. Doing for, so we don't want to do for, and that we don't want to fix all the mistakes. We want to do with, right? We want to do alongside, we want to collaborate, because the doing for is going to invoke a spirit of like, you don't believe that they can do it for themselves, and that's not empowering, right? And then no opportunity for student feedback, right? Students also can give us feedback on how we're doing as instructors, and having being open to that and asking for that is something that can really invoke that spirit of collaboration. The next principle is empowerment. So along with empowerment, Dumbledore says, there is no shame in what you're feeling, Harry. On the contrary, the fact that you can feel pain like this is your greatest strength. How are we empowering our students? As trauma-informed educators on the Dumbledore side, here are some things that the research shows can be really helpful. And I think a lot of you already hit on some of these. So building in choice where possible, right? Here's our learning objective. Here are 2 or 3 different ways you can meet that learning objective with different types of assignments. You choose. Right? Realistic attendance policies and being flexible when needed with attendance policies, and that's built into the syllabus, right? So we expect life to happen, and we're not going to be super punitive about that. Flexibility within the syllabus to decrease those late penalties on assignments, if that's possible, and strengths-based and corrective feedback. On the opposite side, in the Umbridge category, remember it's a spectrum, things that could potentially be detrimental, especially to survivors of trauma, is when choices aren't provided. It's very rigid. It's a one-way street, has to be this way, otherwise you fail at this assignment, you fail in this class. Very rigid and punitive attendance policies, no flexibility built into the syllabus, and harsh criticism within feedback that's not not strengths-based. Anytime you can do more strengths-based feedback around what's going well and what students can also do to grow, that would be more helpful versus the harsh criticism. Okay. And then the last piece of what you'll want to be thinking about as a trauma-informed educator is cultural humility. So Dumbledore says, while we may come from different places and speak in different tongues, our heart beats as one. And so how are we using our humility and multicultural responsiveness within the classroom? Well, on one hand, and if you want to invoke some of these trauma-informed principles of more of that Dumbledore style, you're going to use your pronouns, and you're going to learn students' names and what their preferred names are, and you're going to use those correctly. And if you make a mistake, of course, you can always go back to it and apologize for that. So like I said, we're not perfect. We're people. We're going to address microaggressions in action, right? Because microaggressions can also impact the safety of the classroom. And if as educators and as role models, we're not addressing when a racist comment is made or bias has entered the room, or sexism has entered the room. If we're not identifying that and addressing that in our classrooms, that's going to make it an unsafe space for students. Also acknowledging culturally significant current events that are happening, being able to make space to acknowledge that in the classroom, and acknowledging when cultural mistakes happen, because they can happen, they will happen, but how do you go back and address it and repair the relationship is going to be more of the big takeaway. So what could potentially re-traumatize students, especially survivors of trauma, are going to be that ignoring pronouns, not using preferred names, ignoring microaggressions when they happen in the classroom, or dismissing it, or even using microaggressions ourselves if we're not aware. And also dismissing culturally significant current events, or talking about minimizing the significance of that. So say, for example, a hate crime occurs, we don't acknowledge it, or we call it like an incident. Well, it's not an incident, it's a hate crime, right? So we don't want to minimize some of the trauma that people are experiencing that have these marginalized identities day in and day out. And also dismissing or not addressing cultural mistakes when they happen. We can always come back and address this in the classroom or, outside of the classroom. And so to end with Dumbledore, as I've used a lot of his quotes today, he's that kind of the spirit I want you to think about when you're thinking of trauma-informed educator, or the kind of trauma-informed educator you want to be, and grounding into what those values are for you. He says, it was your heart that saved you. He's speaking to Harry Potter. And acknowledging that, Harry Potter overcame so much, dealt with so many challenges, so many traumatic events, and was able to survive and thrive with the supporters of his friends and also amazing professors like Dumbledore. And for educators in this room, you can be that to students. And so I hope that this information was helpful to you in thinking through some strategies you can build into your course design or your interactions with students, so that you can keep doing the things that are important to you as an educator. Here are some of my references, and that's what I have for content today, and we can get into a discussion.
Excellent. I'm going to start with a big thank you for Giselle sharing that information with us. Very, very informative. So I'll give a round of applause myself for that, and some appreciation coming in from the text chat as well. The first question in the text chat that you probably saw, but we'll kick off with, is could you give an example of what would be a realistic, perhaps trauma-informed attendance policy?
Yeah, that's a great example. So one that I've initiated in one of the courses that I teach would be, so if there is something that is happening where students can't make attendance, especially in an undergraduate course, I've had different attendance makeup assignments that students can do that have reflection questions within the makeup assignment on the weekly module learning objectives. And so if the student doesn't have an illness but can't make it for whatever reason, they can use that other way of meeting that learning objective, and I can count that for attendance. So that's one example of what I've used in my courses, but any way that you can be flexible and try to meet students where they're at to accommodate, but also still grounding into we're still holding high standards and we want you to learn this material, and what are other ways we can do this. That would be more of that trauma-informed teaching.
And I think, Giselle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know something I have heard in the past around trauma-informed teaching is that attendance policy is where you require, say, evidence of your grandmother's funeral or of your illness as being particularly non-trauma informed.
Yes, I would agree. Yes, I would agree. I think that that can be pretty rigid. And so we want students to trust us, and we want to trust students the best we can, and having their best interests at heart. And if the student tells me they can't make it for that reason, I'm going to trust that that's the reason they can't make it.
Right, as well as avoiding the re-traumatization of having to seek out that evidence, or remember while you're at the funeral to take a pamphlet. All of that deepens the trauma or re-triggers the trauma.
Absolutely.
Let's look at maybe a question about, someone says, I teach topics that are deeply disturbing, such as war, gender-based violence, etc. Can you recommend any good resources for ways to teach traumatic topics?
Sure. I think, you can start with some of the resources in the NIU Finding Forward database. There's lots of different pamphlets on trauma-informed teaching. But I think, with those topics, we need to give those content warnings, right? We need to also know that students might need to take care of themselves in different ways, and acknowledge that and be transparent with that. And so I hope I modeled that a bit today. And, I'm talking about a subject that's challenging and can be very triggering for people here, being transparent, acknowledging that. And if you need to step away, if you need to do this in a different way, let's touch base and let me support you in that, so that you can meet the learning goal, and I can support you so that you can still stay well and thrive in this class.
And I think that's a good time to mention the moving forward page. So we have an entire website about trauma-informed teaching that is called Moving Forward. So I put the link to that in the websites. I'm promoting resiliency. We've created it really in returning to campus, but of course, that was because this was what raised visibility of trauma, not because that's the source of all the trauma. So that this recording from today will be posted there as well. So another great question, I think sometimes students don't know they have experienced trauma because this is what they have lived in their life so far. How would a professor identify that a student's non-participation could be a result of trauma?
That's a great question. I think we need to respect students' privacy. And so although we may be able to maybe see some things in the classroom that might be symptoms of trauma, we provide the resources. We have the resources for students if they want to connect with us on that, on getting support. We can connect them there, but also we don't want to push people, right? So it's got to be in their time that they get the support, and what we can do is to have access and have the resources ready and available to students if they want to learn more about this.
And I'll chime in with another takeaway I got from Giselle from what you said, which is we can sort of like universal design for learning means that we don't have to think about remediating accessibility in the moment because we've already planned for it. Being a trauma-informed educator means really building your policies in advance, your structure, your approach to teaching, so that if a student needs help connecting with resources, you can help them, but you're creating a supportive environment regardless of knowing specific students may have trauma or them coming to you to disclose their trauma, just knowing that those supports are in place. We have a hand raised, so I'd love to go to that. I think was that you, Melanie? If you wanted to come on microphone to ask a question.
Yes, I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that I've done this semester that I've never really done in the past, but just more so noticing my students, is public speaking, and really recognizing how it's something that they need. They need oral communication skills. They're in our classes that require oral communication skills as a learning objective. But one thing that I've implemented this semester is just really letting students begin where they are and just asking them to push themselves a little bit further, because with such high anxiety right now, I know that could really, set some students off having to have that standard, or they might start skipping class, or, they'll start falling behind because it's just something that's kind of paralyzing them. And so I really think that our assessment practices I think we need to rethink the way we assess assessment in higher education. We need to give more options. And of course, we need to require these things, but we also probably shouldn't put such a high level of expectation. More so, are you moving yourself in that direction? So where someone begins versus where they end when they leave your course. It's just some thoughts I've been having and playing with. I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that you're thinking really hard about how to support students with different needs, and anytime that we can be more flexible in the choices we're providing to meet the learning goals, right, and making space for how trauma could really be impacting being able to meet some of those learning goals, that's going to be trauma informed. So having that flexibility while also still holding that standard and, learning this material is, what this relationship's about too.
Another question from the chats. What are some suggestions you have for trauma-informed teaching in a different class format? For example, in an online class?
That's a great question. I think, thinking about the online format, students can be more prone to also isolation and not getting that, face-to-face interaction and maybe support that they need. And so that would be one of the things that would want to be scaffolding support into my online class. So even if it's an asynchronous class, I may make spaces for students to come together online or to meet up so that we can support each other. Another big one, especially for me as a student and as an educator, is that responsiveness piece is so important. And I've definitely had experiences where I'm trying to get support from an instructor and I never get that email back. And especially in an online course, that can be really re-traumatizing and cut the trust that students are attempting to build with their teacher. And then they might think, well, this teacher doesn't have my best interests at heart, why even try? So it can be really demoralizing and demotivating when students don't feel cared for or responded to.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Dallas, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, try to pull out the question here. I think the crux of this is looking at the proper balance between being sensitive to the needs of our students and being trauma informed in the classroom versus outside of the classroom. Let's say, for instance, say a student builds trust with you, but has not built enough trust with someone else, such as the counseling center or peer mentors. So what is your role in accommodating the students' need to be heard and accepted, but not crossing the line or the gray area between teaching and their personal life?
Yes, absolutely. That's great. So being professional, right? Having a clear professional boundary is important to not being able to step over, right? We're not their counselor. We might get information that is important and relevant, and it might put up some red flags that the student needs extra support, and we can send them the resources for that. And it is still their choice, right? That empowerment piece, it's their choice what they're going to do with that. And it's not our job to force it upon them, because that could also potentially be re-traumatizing.
And there's so much to be said too for your own boundaries and creating the space, as you started this session with, for doing what you need to do for what's best for you while being empathetic and supportive of others.
Absolutely. And really coming together with each class to have some of those basic principles that help most people with safety, like mutual respect, support, but also opening up the space to have students share their voice around what they may need in that classroom space is also really important and shows that trauma-informed spirit.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions right now, although I may have missed someone's question. Oh, the hand's up again. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just one more question. So some other things that I've been trying in the classroom this semester is some flipped classroom methodology to help them build that safety and security in the space. And one of the things that I'm finding difficult to locate, and I don't know if anybody knows on campus, but I think that studio classrooms are really engaging for students and help them build a more of a sense of safety and security. And so, you know, having round tables and rollable chairs and just, you know, softening the classroom environment so it feels safer for students. I'm hoping that NIU can get more of these kind of spaces, but I haven't been able to really locate one on campus yet, other than the Innovation Center, but it can't be scheduled for classroom teaching. I was wondering if anybody knew about that.
Well, I will chime in on that, Melanie, to say I don't know of any way to look that up right now. The university is pulling together a learning spaces group that will include cross collaboration from the provost office, facilities, the division of IT, and extensive input from both faculty and students on learning space improvements, as well as the provost office has been doing an assessment of learning spaces currently, and we are working together again with a number of people on campus to develop a learning space, a better way to look at the features and functions of the learning spaces we have. So I think there's probably more of that to come, and I will make a note of that as a suggestion and as something that you'd like to have a better window into to inform what we're doing there.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So a few more questions now, Giselle.
Okay, perfect.
So I follow many of the suggestions you have made, such as makeup assignments, meeting with students privately to make up a class, emailing, answering emails within 12 hours, etc. But this semester, I feel a few students have taken advantage of these policies, such as being late for many assignments or skipping many classes. So what were the boundaries that you would recommend, and where do you draw the line in terms of support for trauma impacted students?
Sure. I think, you know, that's going to be a question that each of us are going to have to ask as educators, and also while grounding into what's most important to us as an educator. I think I can speak from my perspective here is I really attempt to try and build in flexibility whenever I can. But there comes a point when it's nearing the end of the semester and past this deadline, I really can't take a look at or grade any more assignments. So I think having that flexibility built in your syllabus, building in choices for assignments, and then also knowing where the cutoff is for students and being clear and transparent around on what that is, of what you can do to help, and then where that's going to end for the semester.
I think that's an ongoing question and actually, again, I'll take a shameless moment to plug make a shameless plug. There we go. Finally got the words out. Our Teaching Effectiveness Institute this spring will be on a pedagogy of kindness. And our speaker is Kate Daniel at Knox College. She will really, I think, investigate or help us unpack this, what feels like it's a binary and probably isn't, between rigor and kindness and setting standards versus being flexible. So I'll put out that that shameless plug now. More information should come out very soon this week about that institute. And so if that's an area you're interested in, I would strongly recommend signing up for that. It'll be in early January. Sorry, I can't help but
No worries.
link to all of these future events. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So how about this one? I'm kind of an old-fashioned teacher and find myself initially resisting some of the suggestions for flexibility, low-stake assignments, etc. They seem like they will increase teachers' workload significantly. So do you have any suggestions for managing the extra work?
Sure. I mean, I think it can take, it's hard to change, right? And so I hear you and saying, like, you know, traditionally I may have used these different strategies, they're more traditional. And now, you know, I'm looking at all of this other research or all these other resources that say change may be more effective or helpful to students. And so just acknowledging that piece, that change is hard, you know, getting support and not expecting yourself to go from a traditional practice to completely on the other side of the extreme, right? Completely flexible and choice driven, right? So that might not be realistic for you, but there's a lot of support that you can get right where you're at to make steps to start doing some of these trauma-informed, start infusing some of these trauma-informed principles. But, you know, we would want to be honest about what's realistic for you and how to build from that as you move forward.
And I like the points you've made about mutuality too and collaboration, that it shouldn't be in either your time or their time, or rigidness or more work for you. All right, I think we'll close out. Lisa has her hand raised, and we'll end with that question. And we'll try to capture some of them from the text chat if we can't answer them now, and reach out to you later. But Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, I also put it in the chat. I'm wondering if it's possible, and let me just say I am not faculty, but I do teach and I have taught before. Let me just say that. Let me also say I'm student-centered and I love students, and I was in the counseling program, period. And I have a master's degree in counseling. Enough with that. But is it possible to do an anonymous trauma assessment at the beginning of class, and then maybe do one at about the 4th week to get an overview of where students are and how they view themselves?
Yeah, I think it's a, you know, interesting idea. I haven't seen it, you know, I haven't seen the research on how that would be implemented, but I think that would be an interesting idea.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the things that you mentioned in the beginning. You listed 8 different areas, and I thought if we or faculty assess students, then perhaps they'll have an idea about how students see themselves or what students see as experiences, and if that changes over time, because they then will have new information and go, oh, you know, when I initially responded, I hadn't thought about that, but now, yeah, I think that's changed. Just a thought.
And I think part of when I heard you speaking about that, I was thinking even in evaluations for courses, you know, are we looking at maybe assessing how students are viewing how we're doing on some of these principles and infusing that piece into our evaluations and where we're getting feedback from students.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, so everyone, if you join me one last time in a big round of applause, feel free to unmute your mics even and clap a bit, or post a thank you to the text chat.
Thank you. It was nice being here.
Very grateful
to
we're very grateful to Giselle for joining us, and I'm very grateful to all of you for taking the time today for learning yourself on such an important topic. This will be posted so that you can share it with your colleagues or review it again if you'd like. And we look forward to seeing you at another upcoming event.